they turned to folklore. Remote places, they wrote about, some churchyard or some abbey, some place which is very far away. They even turned to the medieval past. Some of the legends and stories of medieval times, they reinvented them, but expressed them with a new feeling. And they turned to nature, to common people, and activities of daily life, which was unthinkable in the previous times. They were even drawn to the supernatural. We find certain magical things, spirits, all these descriptions of all these in their narratives. In fact, the poetry of the earlier times was very long. I don't know whether we have the leisure to study those long poems now, but I think people in those times had the leisure since they didn't have the idiot box or other forms of distraction. Anyway, Coleridge and Keats, among other poets, exploited the realm of the supernatural and of what they call, I quote, of the far away and the long ago. Something that is removed, the far away, and the long ago in the past, unquote. Blake, Wordsworth and Shelley assumed the persona of a poet-prophet who writes in a visionary mode of poetry. When they wrote some of these poems, they assumed that they were something like a prophet. Some of them said they had visions. When they sat somewhere on a lakeside or in a forest or somewhere, they said that they had certain vision, and they spoke as if they were making a prophecy. The Romantic poets contrasted poetry with matter of fact, what is just perceived by the physical senses. They contrasted that science with their rich imagination. So these are the broad, salient features of Romantic poetry. I would like to take up some of the prominent poets of this age, one by one, and while discussing the poetry of each one of them, we will be able to appreciate the kind of unique sensibility they had, what they were trying to do, which was different from the other ages of literary composition. William Wordsworth is one of the great poets of the world whose poetic vision is not confined only to the English language. Though he wrote in English, the myriad dimensions of his poetry have universal appeal, and hence he ranks among the great poets of the world. His poems carry a democratic spirit. This democratic spirit, I would like to put it in quotes because this is something which was quite new in those times. Today, it is very common for us to talk about democracy, but in times of monarchy, this was in fact a radical change. So his poems carry a democratic spirit that rejects the themes that earlier poetry focused on and the formal rules of composition that limited the creativity of a poet. Instead, his poems relate to the lives of ordinary people and the remarkable resilience they show in encountering the vagaries of life. His serious treatment of supposedly lowly subjects in common language violated the neoclassical rule of decorum. I said that neoclassical poets dealt with subjects of the upper class. But Wordsworth contrasted it with dealing with supposedly, again in inverted comma, lowly subjects. Lowly in a very different sense, for lack of a better word. Which means he turned to the life of a farmer or a leech gatherer or an old man or a child. So such common subjects he took up, and this was in clear violation of the dominant paradigms of the previous era. Wordsworth delineated his radical views about poetry and poetic diction in the preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, which is regarded as the Manifesto or the statement of the revolutionary aims of romantic movement in English literature. Now, the Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, and then a year later, there was a strong need felt by Wordsworth. Of course, he was motivated by his friends to give a defense of the kind of different poetry that he and Coleridge had composed in this collection of lyrical ballads. So that is why he set out to write a very long preface, and that preface serves as what is called a manifesto of the Romantic period, or also called a statement of the revolutionary aim of the Romantic period. How it differed from the earlier ages, what is the intention with which Wordsworth and his co-poets started to write, and he gives us a very strong defense of his ideas of poetry. In fact, we can even say that he had a certain militant disposition while he wrote this. If we read that, we'll be able to appreciate it much better. In the preface, Wordsworth stresses on taking up situations from common life and employing the language really used by people and characterized by, quote, simple and unelaborated expressions, unquote. Simple expressions, unelaborated expressions. In contrast to the high-flown standard diction. He says, in the preface, I quote, humble and rustic life was generally chosen because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity and are less under restraint and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. The language too of these men has been adopted because such men hourly communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is originally derived. So he is talking of the language used by village folk. He says that it is not spoiled by social convention. If you belong to a certain social class, you need to speak the diction of that class. Whereas the language of the common people, of the villagers, doesn't carry this burden. So he says that they hourly communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is derived. Wordsworth describes the relationship between a poet and nature in this following way, quote, the poet considers man and nature as essentially adopted to each other, and the mind of man as naturally the mirror of the fairest and most interesting properties of nature. And thus the poet, prompted by this feeling of pleasure which accompanies him through the whole course of his studies, converses with general nature. Now these lines, they illustrate his belief that a sensitive poet is in communion with nature. He talked of good poetry arising from a communion, as if we take it in a Christian sense, being with God. So he says that good poetry arises when the poet is in communion with nature. Wordsworth denounces the inane phraseology of modern writers and blames it on the craving for something special that is the result of the uniformity of occupation of urbanites. the uniformity of the occupation of urbanites. Everything is standardized, the vocations that we follow. So that has rendered even our language very inane. We use standard phrases without coming up with anything that is natural or spontaneous. So this preoccupation with inane phraseology produces, quote, degrading thirst for outrageous stimulation, unquote. Degrading thirst for outrageous stimulation. I don't know what he would have said in the present day of our television or FM radio or WhatsApp or what not. Since it is spontaneous, he declares that good poetry, this line is quite famous, is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So poetry is not something that is premeditated, something that you sit and form and then fit in to a meter or to a line, but something that comes out naturally, is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And since it is spontaneous, it is the opposite of artful manipulation of means to foreseen ends, stressed by neoclassical critics. Artful manipulation to foreseen ends. You have an end in mind, that you have to have a very grand composition, which is appreciated by critics, which will earn good reviews. So you fit your language to that means. No, he is completely against it. Wordsworth is radical when he downplays the distinction between prose and poetry. This is something which is of course controversial. Many have disagreed with him. Even Coleridge, later when he wrote his autobiographical narrative, Biographia Literaria, had disagreements with this aspect of Wordsworth. Though actually they collaborated when they produced lyrical ballads, but this is a point which they disagreed. But Wordsworth does make a very important point when he attacks the distinction between poetry and prose. He calls it a false distinction, and he has his reasons for doing so. He states, and I quote, "A large portion of every good poem will be in the language of prose that is well written." He even gives an illustration. He takes a poem and marks a few lines, and he says, the rest of the lines are all meaningless, but these lines are as good as prose, and they are also very rhythmical, pleasing to read. So he carefully qualifies this doctrine in which he believes by describing his poetry as, quote, emotion recollected in tranquility. Of course, he made a very radical statement when he said that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of emotions. But he also qualified his statement, added to this statement by saying that it is emotion which is recollected in tranquility, not in a rush or in a disturbed state. And by specifying that a poet's spontaneity is the result of prior process of deep reflection. So he doesn't discount the role of deep reflection. He does give importance to deep reflection, but that reflection should not be manipulative, used for a certain definite, keeping a definite end in mind. Keats endorses this view of Wordsworth. Keats has a line where Keats endorsed him saying, and I quote, "If poetry comes not naturally as the leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all." Very, very meaningful lines. Hence, Wordsworth rejects the mechanical use of meter and figures of speech. I stress mechanical use. He is not against meter or rhyme, because if you read many of his poems, they have a kind of rhyme, they also have kind of meter. But he says that the lines have to come spontaneously, and he uses the word superadded. The meter and other things can be superadded by the poet later. So he makes a distinction between composing by keeping the meter in mind and meter evolving organically. This is also stated by Coleridge. I will come to later. So, thus, Wordsworth set out to make poetry the expression of genuine feeling and also to bring it closer to people, out of the courts or even the religious centers, to the people. Wordsworth has also something to say to the readers. The readers also can't take his poetry easily. They also have a responsibility. So he tells them, he appeals to the readers, in judging these poems, he would decide by his own feelings genuinely and not by reflection upon what will probably be the judgment of others. Many times we approve of what others approve. If somebody says this poem is good, this film is good, we too raise our hands. But we need to listen to the voice of our heart. We may have to disagree with the herd. Wordsworth is often referred to as a nature poet. Much as this epithet holds good to Wordsworth, it reduces the broad sweep of his oeuvre to just one facet of his poetry and ignores the various themes that Wordsworth dealt with. Of course, in our schools we are all taught that Wordsworth was a nature poet, which is true to quite a large extent. Even the other poets, they also wrote about nature. Nature was a very central preoccupation. They came back to it again and again. But that is only one aspect of their poetry. So we need to look beyond that. Apart from Wordsworth's preoccupation with nature, one can observe the mature and refined manner in which he blends nature, rustic life, simple human beings, religions, and events having political significance, while giving expression to the fervent churnings that his heart experienced when he was a witness to the world around him and the major events of his times. Wordsworth's poetry can be classified under the following headings to get a glimpse of the different issues with which he was concerned in his long career as a poet, and also to get acquainted with the extent of his prolific output. He wrote poems referring to childhood, poems on affections experienced, how he was moved in some situations in his own life, poems of the imagination, something coming purely out of imagination, not related to reality, memories of tours undertaken. He has composed poems on where he went, what he saw, poems on independence and liberty. All romantic poets were very much affected by the political developments that happened in their times. Then ecclesiastical sonnets, dealing with religion, sonnets, poems referring to old age, even epitaphs and elegies. So Wordsworth has written all these. I would like to discuss a few poems referring to the period of childhood. Wordsworth composed many poems that refer to childhood. These poems are not merely sentimental or nostalgic about childhood that the poet has lost. Many times we get nostalgic of our childhood and even the past. Those gone are the days. We talk in that spirit, but it's not just that. He speaks with childhood, with a lot of feeling about innocence, how a child perceives the world, how it is so sensitive to the nature around it. the poems deal with various dimensions of the unique cosmos which is created by the power of imagination of children. The unique cosmos. The children live in their own cosmos. Very different from the, what you call the transactional world that we live in, of give and take. So that unique cosmos he was trying to explore in these poems. As an illustration, I would like to touch upon this poem titled We Are Seven. A little girl says that she and her siblings add up to 7 members. The 2 of her siblings are no more. The 2 dead siblings, she counts even the 2 who are dead among her siblings. Even after their death, the child, continues to regard them as her siblings. The 2 deceased siblings are very much alive for the girl in her imagination. She plays with them, knits sitting by their grave, has supper, sitting next to their grave. The poet, who is an adult and a rational being, who goes by reason, is baffled at the refusal of the girl to acknowledge that her long dead siblings are no more. When he sees it, he doesn't understand. Why is it that the child doesn't understand the 2 are dead? But the child, relates to its siblings in its own way. Then, the poem, which begins with the line, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow," talks of how children are sensitive to the beauty of nature. The poet prays that this sensitivity should be with him throughout his life, else it means death to him. This is, of course, how we lose our sensitivity as we grow up. We see everything in terms of right and wrong, classifying things into this and that. But when we see something beautiful in nature, we have lost that sensitivity to appreciate it, to behold it as something wonderful. The poem goes like this: "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old. Or let me die." It's better to die than to lose this ability to appreciate the beauty of nature. Now, in this poem comes this famous line, "The child is father of the man. And I wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety." So piety need not be only in a religious sense. Even nature can make us pious. In the poem titled Lucy Gray, which is also a subtitle Solitude, Wordsworth describes the tragic fate of a little girl who has to go to town and bring back her mother on a stormy night carrying a lantern. The girl sets out but doesn't reach her mother. There is no trace of Lucy. Eventually, she becomes a mysterious figure. Some even say she was sighted singing a song in the wilderness. So Wordsworth's engagement with childhood is very varied, very complex. Turning to Wordsworth's poems on rustic life and simple folk, people who were common beings. According to the emphatic declaration Wordsworth made in the preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, he composed many poems on ordinary men and women and their humble lives. Nothing special, nothing grand. The poem Resolution and Independence begins with a description of a morning following a night of heavy rain accompanied by strong wind and snow. Everything has returned to its joyous, normal state. This induces a sense of ecstasy in the poet. Just the same, he is gripped with a sense of solitude, pain of heart, distress and poverty. Some feeling which he can't explain. When he is immersed in thought, he notices an old man who is weighed down not only by the weakness brought about by old age and sickness, but also by something of, quote, a more than human weight upon his frame. The frame is the body. Of course, the old age it's difficult for him to carry the weight of his body, but the old man has some worry also, along with the weakness of the old age. So he calls it a more than human weight upon his frame. When the poet inquires about the occupation the old man pursued, the old man replies that he gathers leeches, wandering from pond to pond and moor to moor, and thus earns his livelihood. The leech gatherer. So a poem about a leech gatherer, such an insignificant person. He adds that the number of leeches has dwindled, and yet he perseveres in his occupation. I am sure he would find no leech at all in the present times because of the kind of environmental degradation that is happening now. The old man's demeanor and his words bothered the poet, and eventually he realizes that the old man is endowed with a strong will even as his body is decrepit. So, Wordsworth poet also looks at the resilience, as I said earlier, that people who are bogged down by the vagaries of life, they also have a very strong spirit. So he identifies that, by which, the spirit by which they carry on with their lives. Wordsworth also wrote a poem on beggars. Quite a long poem, in fact, running to nearly 50 lines. Then there are some poems that celebrate the profound impact that nature had on Wordsworth's consciousness. Wordsworth was very passionate about nature, and his poems reflect how deeply his heart was affected by the aesthetic appeal of nature, the beauty that he saw in nature and how that beauty affected his heart. His poems emanate from a heart that is intensely swayed by the resonance that nature produces. One has to have such an open heart to receive these resonances. This leads Wordsworth to recognize divinity in every aspect of nature. For example, in the poem The Tables Turned, Wordsworth declared the supremacy of knowledge given by nature over that gained by studying books. He says, one impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can. Yeah. In fact, some critics can't digest, what I said, the radical views of Wordsworth. And he said that regarding common language, that by good poetry emanates by spending more time with speaking to villagers, their unadulterated, unsophisticated language, and by living in communion with nature. Some of the urbanite critics can't comprehend the greatness of this statement. In his famous poem, quite a long title, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood. The title itself is so meaningful. He declared, there was a time when meadow, grove and stream, the earth and every common sight to me did seem apparent in celestial light. The whole nature, it is illuminated with heavenly light. Wordsworth was disillusioned by the materialism prevalent in the society around him. He was disgusted with the craving for more and more money and wealth. The consequence of the sole preoccupation of accumulating huge wealth and spending it in a reckless manner was that human beings became insensitive to the beauty of the nature which sustained them. One wonders what his state of mind would have been on seeing the consumerism of the present days. In a sonnet published in 1807, he says, it's a very meaningful poem, "The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers." Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. This sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers, for this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. These beautiful things in nature moves us not. It doesn't touch our heart. Great God, I would rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. See, there's a lot of contempt for pagans, heathens, as they are called, with contempt. But he says he prefers to be a pagan, following some superstition or some tribal belief or something. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, that is an open area of grassy land, so might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. Now I am very sad, I am forlorn. But if I can stand in nature and see something beautiful, I can be less forlorn, and I can have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. Have sight of Proteus rising from the sea god, or hear old Triton blow his wreath on. Triton is the messenger of sea. So we can even call it hallucination if you want in psychological terms. But this is how he, was charged with sense of beauty regarding the sea. Would I have 10 minutes? Moving on to another great and unconventional poet, William Blake. He was a very brilliant poet. In fact, his poems are very rich with symbolism. We need to understand those symbols if we have to get at the meaning of these poems. And he invented his own mythology to convey his ideas. Many poets make use of mythology of the ancient times, but he invented some of his own mythical stories. And he was a very celebrated painter too. The Romantic age also had its expression in painting, and Blake was an exceptional painter. Blake claimed to have seen visions beginning from his childhood. Whether we believe them or not is a different matter, but he called many of his poems as visions or prophecies. This is how he treated them. He thought that we have war, injustice and happiness because our way of life is founded on mistaken beliefs. The way we understand life is because of the mistake in the beliefs that we hold. The world is a bad place. We know only a small part of reality through our five senses. Yet, we concern ourselves almost entirely with scientific truth and the materialistic values gained through our senses. So, I said earlier that all these romantic poets, they longed for the infinite, something that is beyond physical reality. So I think this is what Blake was trying to do. We shall not understand the vast reality beyond our senses and achieve full control of ourselves until we learn to trust our instincts, energies and imaginations. For Blake, this was the basis of all personal, social and religious truth. Blake wrote quite a famous poem, A Poison Tree. It had also the title Christian Forbearance. The speaker of the poem tells us that when he was angry with his friend, he simply told his friend and the anger was settled. But with his enemy, he didn't air his grievance, and so the anger grew. And the implication of this was that the poison tree, grew up, and finally hatred started to eat away oneself. Hatred always turns inward, corrupting into self-hatred. So the poison tree goes like this. I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it not, my wrath did grow. I watered it in fears, night and morning with my tears, and I sunned it with smiles and with soft, deceitful wiles. Hypocrisy. And it grew both day and night, till it bore an apple bright. This is, of course, the reference to the forbidden fruit in the Genesis. My foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine, and into my garden stole when the night had veiled the pole. In the morning, glad I see my foe outstretched beneath the tree. Finally, the other person is dead. Blake shows the opposite sides of human nature in such contrasting poems as The Lamb and the Tiger. The Tiger is, again, quite a famous poem. Children like to recite it, tiger, tiger, burning bright. Where the spelling of tiger is quite different, T-Y-G-E-R. And The Lamb is a poem which talks about innocence, which is also a part of human nature, contrasted with ferocity that you find in a tiger. The lamb is also a symbol for Jesus Christ. And capital L, Lamb, God. I would also like to quote from his poem Auguries of Innocence, the first stanza. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. These are, you can think of them as contradictions, as something impossible. But the fervent, intense feeling of the poet is such that he can do it in his imagination. He is able to surpass the obstacles to these things in his thought. Moving on to John Keats. Keats' poetry is concerned with joy in the beauty of the world, sorrow over its inevitable passing. Of course, joy or even anything isn't permanent. It has to pass, inevitable passing. And attempts to find bridges between the perishable world that we know and the eternal world that we imagine. So this was the preoccupation of his poetry. He employs unusually rich and vivid images to express his intense feelings. Endymion is a long poem about a shepherd who won the love of the goddess of moon. Its opening line is this famous line, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever." That's the opening line of this long poem, Endymion. Keats believed that appreciation of the beauty of nature can lead to the understanding of eternal truth. Some of the famous compositions of Keats are Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale, On Melancholy, to Autumn. The Romantic poets were also critics. I wouldn't say critics, rather than critics I would use the word those who advocated poetics, the nature of poetics, because they had to establish the different kind of poetry that they wrote. They also wrote essays and their views on poetry are found in their letters to their friends and others. So Keats talked of the concept of negative capability, which is used in criticism. It is the exploration of many possibilities of the subjects with which a poem is concerned, but it does not insist on any one answer to the enduring problems of human life. Keats' main poetic concern was the intense experience of life and not its perfect understanding. Then Percy Shelley. Shelley had a rebellious spirit from a young age. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, to use a cliched expression, but his family was politically well collected. At a young age, he wrote a pamphlet titled The Necessity of Atheism, and he paid the price. He was expelled from Oxford University for it. Shelley believed that the people of Ireland were being oppressed by their English rulers and tried to rouse them to rebel against England. His revolutionary poem titled Queen Mab attacked both political tyranny and Orthodox Christianity. Shelley paid the price by having to live in exile in Italy because of his political views. Shelley's wife was Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, the horror. In fact, if we look at Byron, Mary Shelley and others, they also composed what are called Gothic epics. That is, they took some story from the ancient past and added a lot of fantasy to it, something which happens in very imaginative ways, big elements of horror, etc. They were trying to convey their ideas in an allegorical way, instead of making political statements, Mary Shelley has talked about a lot about Shelley's political engagements, the way he associated himself with political movements, and that he and his associates were all persecuted and he had to live in exile. Unfortunately, he died at the age of 29 when he drowned in the sea. In his most ambitious long poem, Prometheus Unbound, Shelley attempted to combine his imaginative faith with his hopes for humanity. At the end, this is something which everybody would desire. Earthly rulers and government institutions are defeated, and love and beauty reign, but perhaps not forever. Shelley states in the preface to a long poem titled The Revolt of Islam. In fact, the preface is something like a political pamphlet. The preface itself is like that. A long poem comprising 12 cantos that he uses his political skill, I quote, in the cause of a liberal and comprehensive morality, in the view of kindling within the bosoms of my readers a virtuous enthusiasm for those doctrines of liberty and justice, that faith and hope in something good, which neither violence nor misinterpretation nor prejudice can ever totally extinguish among mankind. He wants to show, again I quote, the impatience at all the oppressions which are done under the sun. All kinds of oppressions. This is a quotation. All the oppressions which are done under the sun. Its tendency to awaken public hope and to enlighten and improve mankind. The awakening of an immense nation from their slavery and degradation to a true sense of moral dignity and freedom. Some of these lines sound very close to how Swami Vivekananda spoke, calling for an awakening. And the bloodless dethronement of their oppressors and the unveiling of the religious frauds by which they had been deluded into submissions. In those days when religion had a far greater hold over the minds of people, so he called for, he sort of exposed the tyranny of the church, and this call for a bloodless dethronement of the oppressors talks of non-violence, a change which is change of rule brought about in a non-violent way. Shelley's final poems are very grim and sorrowful. However, he always looks towards the hope of inspiration, as in his poem Ode to the West Wind. He says, "Scatter as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Scatter my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy." Coleridge was a poet and philosopher. His famous long poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, was published in the Lyrical Ballads. It marked a shift from the common subjects being the theme of the poetry. The poem narrates the experiences of a sailor who has returned from a long sea voyage. It talks of how they killed an albatross, a bird in the sea, and the sailor felt guilty about it. And when the ship is caught in a storm, the sailors believe that it was because of the killing of the bird. And finally, of course, the ship somehow lands in his homeland. But he uses the vision of a ghost ship, etc., in this quite a long poem. Coleridge's other famous poems are Kublai Khan and Christabel. It is said, perhaps incorrectly, that Kublai Khan was inspired by an opium dream. Coleridge had chronic illness, and he used to take opium as a painkiller. So when he was under the influence of the drug, some people say he composed many of the poems, which may not be true also. Both the poems, that is Kublai Khan and Christabel, deal with the visionary and supernatural elements, and they bring up psychological insights with precise pictures of natural scenes in his meditative lyrics. Coleridge established the principle that a poem is an organic unity and not born out of a mechanical composition, something which echoes what Wordsworth said. Therefore, he believed that a poem cannot be paraphrased. I think that this is something which is quite evident. You can summarize an article or an essay, you can give its gist, but giving a gist of a poem, I think, loses all the richness of it. Coleridge described neoclassical rules as something imposed on the poet from without, from outside, imposed on the poet. He substituted those rules with the concept of inherent organic laws of the poet's imagination. Inherent, something that comes from within, laws of composition. He conceives that each poetic work, like a growing plant, evolves according to its own internal principles into a final organic form of its own. Coleridge's best-known work of criticism is his Biographia Literaria, or also called Biographical Sketches of My Literary Life and Opinions, in which his valuable opinions and insights into literature are found. Actually, he began it as a preface to one of his poems, but as he went on writing them, he included all his experiences right from his young age. So it grew into an autobiography of many chapters. Coleridge gave the term willing suspension of disbelief. This is again widely used in criticism, which is a willingness to suspend one's critical faculties and believe in something surreal, to sacrifice realism and logic for the sake of enjoyment. I think without this suspension of disbelief, we can't watch any film or the television. We have to, believe in whatever is shown. Without this capability, we wouldn't have been able to watch those things. In conclusion, I would like to say that even a glimpse of poems composed by the Romantic poets, especially those by Wordsworth, and their novel and revolutionary ideas about poetry inspire us to go deeper into the entire awe of their poetry and their writings on what poetry ought to be. This will enable us to rediscover the Romantic poets for ourselves in order to gain newer perspectives about their poems in particular and poetry in general. It would also make us sensitive to the world around us, to reshape our views on contemporary issues, to refine our sensibilities, and to motivate us to formulate a sustainable future. Thank you.